Hello, welcome to Only for Your Ears. And today's segment is episode number 3. The title is The Little Matchstick Girl, which I have renamed to This Little Girl Entered Heaven. The structure will be the same as usual, a summary which highlights the main points, then a critical review talking about how it plays in society today, and then the trigger points. One note, the sound will be restored as soon as possible. Let's begin. It was a cold winter's night, and a small, very poor girl was walking down a dark street. It was New Year's Eve, and it was snowing. The little girl had no staff, no shoes, and no hat either to keep her warm. She had left the house in her mother's slippers, but they were too big for her little feet. She lost one when she ran across the street in fear so as not to be run over by carriages grinding through the slushy ice water. A boy had stolen the other slipper. She proceeded to walk the streets in the hope of selling matches. She had put the rest in her apron while holding a box in her hands, offering it to passers-by. She failed to sell a single box today and was afraid to go home without a penny she earned, so she continued to wander the streets. I digress here, people. Why is this little girl afraid to go home, and who is she afraid of? It seems she's afraid of maybe a male figure whom she fears may beat her just because he can't get a job. So he sends his child out to do the slave labor. By now, the little girl was soaked to the skin and very hungry. She hadn't eaten all day, and her fragile body felt the damp cold in her bones as she searched the streets looking for a hope of a customer or food on the ground. While she walked through the city, she could smell fresh air and delight in the imagined taste of freshly baked bread in her mouth as she passed by the bakery. It was New Year's Eve after all, and many people enjoyed roasted geese and many assorted foods to celebrate the end of the year. At this point, the little girl's hunger intensified. I digress again. This reminds me of a typical New Year's Eve in England, when my mother would bake her famous rum cake. She would soak the raisins for about 6 weeks in Jamaica's finest rum. Rare Nephew rum is overproof rum and is still lethal today, but after you bake it, the alcohol evaporates. But the smell was divine, and we would usually eat it 15 minutes after it came out of the oven and with cream. For our family, it was the best way to celebrate the end of the year. The girl came to an alley where she could sit and rest her tired body against the wall. She dared not go home as she knew that she'd get well beaten by her father, who she lived with in a drafty attic with bits of rag to block the cold breeze. So it was pointless going home. There was no warmth. The girl lit a match and wrapped her hands around the flame to keep them warm, which were numb. But the flame had a strange color. It seemed like the flame reached out to be a stove. That made her want to stretch her legs out to warm her whole body. But as soon as she did this, the flame quickly went out and disappeared. The girl was left with a burnt match in her hand. Sooner or later, the girl lit another match in the hope a roasted goose would appear before her. She imagined an oak table filled with goodies and gave relief to hunger. But this time her imagination gave birth to a large, colourful Christmas tree with beautiful lights. This tree was beyond her wildest imagination. Thousands of candles lit the tree, burning brightly in the dark, cold night. But it didn't feel cold when she reached out to warm her hands on the candle. This time, the candle appeared like tiny stars, creating a magical glow around her. The little girl became fascinated by the glorious sight of thousands of stars dancing on the tree. However, the stars created a trail behind her as one star was falling. This made her shudder and thought about someone died at this very moment. When she was a little girl, her grandmother told her that when a star is falling, it means someone is going to heaven. The girl lit a new match and the flame revealed the image of her grandmother. The surprised girl shouted after her grandmother. Her eyes welled up as she asked her old good grandmother to take her to heaven with her. She knew her grandmother would disappear as soon as the match burned out. So she quickly lit the remaining matches so her dear grandmother, the stove, roasted goose, and the Christmas tree would stay and keep her warm in the cold night air. After the cold and the clear morning dawned, the passers-by saw a girl with red cheeks and a lovely smile in a small passageway between houses. The girl was leaning against the wall, and when they approached her, they saw that the girl had died. Her body was frozen, and burned matches were scattered around her. The people felt sorry for the little girl and thought all she wanted was to warm herself. But little did they know all the beautiful things she had seen that night. The beautiful smile showed she had ascended to heaven and her grandmother to a nicer place. What a beautiful, beautiful story and a wonderful spiritual ending to this story. But now a critical review of how this story plays in society today. The first sentence I want to look at. She was afraid to go home without a penny she earned, so she continued to wander the streets. I believe this story is about the vicious cycle of poverty this little girl was trying to survive in. Her father reminds me of someone who couldn't be the breadwinner in his own family and exploited the vulnerability of his own daughter. She was afraid of her father and his insecurities. So if she wasn't able to bring home the bacon, then it would be her fault. There's a good reason to beat her, so she continued to walk the streets on New Year's Eve in the hope she'd be able to attract a miracle that someone would buy a match. Well, good luck with that. Everybody was too busy rushing to get home, and unfortunately, nobody has the time to stop for a very poor girl selling matches, especially on such an auspicious night. When I received a beating at home, it was awful. I had to wait all day long until my father arrived, and then I was punished by being hit with my dog's lead. This memory would stay etched in me for years to come. You see, I just didn't get the abuse, but my father would inflict more pain by saying, if you cry, he'd give me something to cry about. Talk about repressed feelings. Food, glorious food. She could smell the fresh air and delight in the imagined taste of freshly baked bread melting in her mouth. We see how the little girl's imagination begins to soar with colorful images of roasted meats, just as her situation becomes too daunting for her to deal with. I don't blame her. She recalls an elaborate table full of delicious food that will satisfy her hunger, but the sight of the roasted geese made her mouth water. The food filled her with a homely feeling, whilst the beautiful Christmas tree brought a sense of happiness. And that's what people need around this time of year. Her imagination is a place of peace and joy, while she almost freezes to death. This moment is so sad. Christmas and New Year's Eve is the worst time of the year to be desperate, cold, alone, unloved, and scared. This is why so many people end up taking their lives, because of the loneliness and feeling unloved. This moment reminded me of a scene in the film Oliver, when a little orphan boy goes up to the master and asks for, "Please, sir, can I have some more?" And the man says, "More?" It was just as cold outside as it was at home. Well, it's clear she made the best choice to stay resting her tired body so she could spend her last living hours in the presence of her grandmother, whom she manifested by lighting a match. Her grandmother is the only good memory of a good person in her life that she loved and worshipped. It seems as though her grandmother, her mother, and her father were very discontented with life, period, let alone raising a child. She created an environment where she could feel loved, be nurtured, and be the child that feels joy in life about festivities without having to deal with the obligations of a child in poverty. A glow of warmth surrounded her. Well, that roasted goose manifested before her eyes to tease her with delicious smells only she could imagine. A Christmas tree stood majestically before her with tiny candles reminding her of what this season really meant. The glow of laughter, joy, gratitude, and love. It didn't have to be perfect, but the feeling of togetherness with her family without the heaviness of poverty and lack hovering around them to kill the mood was enough to push anyone away. The perfection part is society projecting their fake idea of what Christmas and New Year should bring. Have you ever noticed that during this time, people become extremely kind by saying nice words, but would rarely extend a hand to help someone, not even with a few pennies, so the little girl could go home and save face? Christmas has completely lost its spirit of what it really meant to be, what it's really meant to be about. It's all about money, 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 money. And the rest of the following year, you scratch your head and think, what does it mean to be kind? What does it mean to be really kind? The flame of vision. Surprisingly, as the little girl lit several matches, the image of her grandmother appeared. This must have been the best New Year's present she could have ever imagined. The spiritual aspect is the most riveting part of her journey to happiness. As she rests against the wall, The sight of her grandmother lifts her spirit and gives the little girl that last drop of hope for a new life. The desperation fills her entire being as she senses the only good part of her existence is fading away amongst the dying flames. She cries out, "Please don't go, take me with you." The spirit really embraced her heart. It didn't matter that her life was going to end as long as she could be with the only person she knew who truly loved her. So she lets all the matches burn around her as she falls asleep and ascends to her desired place with her beloved grandmother. This is so beautiful because she experiences of such a perfect sense of family togetherness. The peaceful smile stretched across her face is a message to all those people standing around her dead body that she's blissfully happy up there amongst the stars and with her grandmother. So incredible. So incredible. Now we go to the trigger points. So what is a trigger point? A trigger point is a reminder, basically a reminder of an event, a trauma, an emotional situation, a psychological pain that we had many years ago that comes back to haunt us in the middle of our maybe recovery or our health, when we're feeling healthy and good about ourselves. It comes back as if to say, tap, 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 remember me. And then if we don't know how to heal or we don't know how to deal with these triggers, we can be easily pulled back to the very place where we were in the basement psychologically and emotionally, sick, unhealthy, and addicted in some cases. So that's what a trigger is. I'm going to look at some of the trigger points or the points that triggered me and maybe triggered you in this story. The first one comes to mind about the slave labor, when the father just sort of go out and get some work, go out and sell some matches. A child, not even 13 years old. Nike, Puma, Zara, and Apple all come to mind. All these multinational companies exploiting children in slave labor in China and in Bangladesh, and in poor working conditions. This was a big trigger for me because all these companies, they make loads of money. Apple is economically the size of, I don't know, Barbados or maybe Switzerland. I mean, it's so much money, and at the same time, so much greed that they can't even pay these workers, these young children, a decent wage for the work that they're doing. A lot of them have deformed fingers and hands because of the type of packing that they have to do to assemble these phones together. Let me give you an example. There was a man, an American man, who did a one-woman show about Apple. He was so disgusted with what he saw. He had an iPhone, and a couple of years ago, he realized that there was something wrong with his iPhone, and he decided to go to repair it himself instead of going to one of these places to get it repaired. So he tried to repair it and he couldn't do it. And he's very tech savvy and he just couldn't do it. So he was on a mission and he decided to go to China. the Apple factory, and see if he could get any help and see what was going on. So when he got there, he saw all these children between the ages of 10 and 16 jamming their fingers into boxes and trying to assemble these full phones and living in the worst conditions, in maybe in one room, 10 children in one room, working 14 hours a day, every day, even weekends. And he was appalled by it. So when he came back to the United States, he demanded to speak to Steve Jobs. And so he spoke to him. He said, you know, I went all the way to China to see how you pack your products and to find out if I could learn how to repair my phone. And I was appalled by what I saw. Children between 10 and 16 years old working 14 hours a day. And do you know what not Donald Trump, Steve Jobs said? So I worked 20 hours a week and didn't care. I was disgusted by this myself when I heard the story, but then I was even more disgusted by Zara and some of these big name fashion houses who use young children in slave labor to produce their products. There was one story in Bangladesh that I want to refer to. They were working in a factory, terrible conditions, and in one situation, the whole floor collapsed and hundreds of people died. People that were standing on the floor that collapsed died, and people that were below the floor collapsed and also died. It was a disaster. And do you know what Zara did? And these fashion places did? Just distance themselves. They tried to escape the embarrassment, but they couldn't because they had to fork out money in restoration. And I was particularly appalled by Zara because Amancio Ortega, he's from Spain. I used to live in Spain. And this man comes from a very, very humble background. And you would have thought that he would have the decency to make sure that the conditions were okay. But again, it's about money. They didn't care. The second trigger is very personal to me, but I will share it with you. And it's part of my own family. My father was living with his girlfriend in Dulwich somewhere. And then he moved us out of the house that we were in and decided to move us into a house very close to him and where his girlfriend was living, just around the corner, to be honest. And he found that he could not keep up the 2 payments for the house. Well, my sister had an excellent job with a prestigious bank in England, working in the international section. And back then in the day, in the early 80s, if you were making £800 to £900 a month, that was fantastic. That was really, really good money. And she was making that. Well, my dad decided to just exploit her and use her. And he basically said, you have to do this, you have to pay this. He demanded that she pay at least 700 of her money to pay for bills that he could not afford to pay for. It was a disaster. And my sister would walk around the streets when she was working up in Knightsbridge, and she'd be walking around the streets with broken shoes on because she couldn't afford to buy anything. She couldn't afford to buy anything. She only had £200 to pay for transportation, food, and that was it. He just completely used her and abused her. And then something incredible happened. She was able to get from under the clutches of his exploitive behavior and leave him. Just leave him and say, I'm not going to pay any more money. And she's happy. She got married. She has a kid. She's doing good. And that's the reversal of this trigger. In both cases, both triggers that I've illustrated, something good has come out of it. Oh, the first trigger, I must have forgotten, is that what's happened now with these multinational companies is that people are educating these children. The infrastructure is being developed around these factories so people can live in good conditions, good apartments, and at the same time have these children get an education and even give them some pocket money so they can do well while they're working. So those are the two triggers and the positive side coming out of those two triggers. The last trigger is really about the slavery that's taken place all over the world. I mean, of course, you hear the most popular slavery from Black History Month, but there's all types of slavery that's taken place all over the world, including amongst white people. So it's everywhere. But I want to talk about the plantations and the slavery that took place, or the slave trade that actually began in Ghana, in Africa, the African continent. The doors and the gateway opened to slavery in Ghana, went to the West Indies, then came to England, and also was in the United States and in Canada, I believe, but mainly in the United States. These people worked under horrendous conditions and were beaten at the same time, just horribly beaten, living in terrible conditions, robbed of any kind of education, robbed of their own freedom to provide for other people, which is basically what the children were doing in China and in Bangladesh. But the good thing that's come out of slavery was the awareness of a politician in England, especially in England, because a lot of the West Indians came to England. And in actual fact, it's mentioned in Jane Austen's book, where she is very aware of plantations because she was raised on a plantation until she came to England. And in Jane Austen's book, she spends a very, very long time and gives detail upon detail of the plantation and the slavery that took place on her father's plantation. And there was a man called William Wilberforce. I think it was in the 18th century. He was a white politician, and he demanded that the slave trade come to an end, and he brought it to an end. So that's the positive side of it. The positive side of the slavery in the United States is that they have got some kind of financial bonus or financial compensation after all the abuse that took place, but you could never pay that back, not really. But it was the ending of the slave trade with William Wilberforce in England and with Abraham Lincoln in the United States that helped to rectify some of the atrocities that took place. For me, Black History Month is a celebration of the heroic people that freed the slaves, especially with Harriet Tubman, and many examples of Black heroic leaders and activists throughout the United States, even the West Indies, Marcus Garvey. Then you have Noela Davis from Canada. You have so many people that we have stood on their shoulders and reaped the benefits from the fruits that they birthed. So that's something to be proud of. So this is the end of today's segment, and I would like to leave you with a phrase. Healing is a gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Healing is a lifelong gift we give ourselves, mind, body, and soul. Stay blessed and stay happy. And if you want to leave a comment, please, I welcome your comments. I welcome if you would like to subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. You could just press the button and subscribe, or you can give me a like. It helps with the algorithms. Thank you. Stay blessed. Goodbye.